Okay, let's go ahead and get started. I'm Dan Slater, Director of the White House Center for Democracies. We are really delighted today. We're delighted you're all here. We're especially delighted that our postdoctoral fellow, Ricarda will be speaking to us about her ongoing dissertation to article to book to her project. And it's a little bit, the timing is a little funny. It's sort of both a welcome and a farewell. It's a fair welcome, I guess. It's a hybrid, because Ricky's been with us for 2 years. We've been really honored to have her with us as part of the community here. And she's been working on this fantastic project, which won the 2022 American Sociological Association Dissertation Award. They just call it the Dissertation Award. So it's that's how big it is. There's no modifiers. She won the Dissertation Award for the dissertation she wrote in 2021 from Brown University. And so this work it was remarkable when it came. It's come a long way. It's really pushing, I think, in new ways to bring together the sociology of race and the sociology of democratization in some really creative and original ways. So we're going to learn a lot from the talk. We're really glad she's here. We're really sad she's leaving, but we're glad that she's been here for the past 2 years. So please join me in welcoming Ricky Hammer.
Good. All right. Hi, everyone. First of all, thank you so much, Dan, for this really kind introduction. Thank you, Derek, for all the work you do behind the scenes in organizing our events. And thank you all for coming. So I thought I would take a bit of a risk today and talk to you about a new framing of what I'm thinking about for the book. And I will use a case study, one of my chapters in the book, which is about the revolutionary years of Saint-Domingue, which was a French colony and is now Haiti. And this is really the first time I'm articulating this. So I'm really looking forward to your feedback, particularly because a lot of people in this room have been really essential in helping me to think through this transition from dissertation to book. So shout out to Luciana, Dan, Bajak, and also Adam and Brendan. Obviously, if this doesn't make sense, it's not your fault. Okay. Okay, so my project is about how the racialized and colonized claimed belonging in the face of exclusion. And in the book, I look at 4 cases in the French and English empires that present different instances and strategies of this. And in the case I discussed today, which, as I said, is the first chapter of my book, I will show you how the revolutionary leaders in Saint-Domingue, now Haiti, articulated this question. And my argument really goes against a lot of the conceptions and genealogies that you all will have in your mind. So I just invite you to come on this journey with me. This is the argument. 1, we tend to think about modern citizenship in terms of nation states, when really a lot of this happened in the context of empire. 2, we think that the question of how the racialized and the colonized claimed belonging emerges when the racialized immigrants arrives in Europe in the post-war immigration of the 1950s and 60s. But I argue that it in fact emerges much earlier in the process in which the colonized aim to articulate belonging and the colonizer denies it. And then 3, this forces us to rethink our conceptualization and genealogy of modern citizenship. So let me talk you through this argument in a bit more detail. We tend to begin our analyses of modern citizenship with a particular historiography of the French Revolution that assumes the nation state as a unit of analysis. This is historically incorrect because France and indeed most European countries at the time were in fact empires. Think, for example, of Roger Brubaker's famous work. Brubaker explains the making of modern citizenship along these lines. It's the formal delimitation of the citizenry, the establishment of civil equality, entailing shared rights and shared obligations, the institutionalization of political rights, the legal rationalization and ideological accentuation of the distinction between citizens and foreigners. And then he adds, the French Revolution brought all these developments together on a national level for the first time. So the nation state is assumed. All right, so as I said, the nation state in a lot of this literature is assumed, and it becomes a naturalized unit of analysis. And as a result, a large part of the social sciences have remained blind to the struggles of the enslaved and colonized peoples for these very rights that took place at this very same time. We've either simply not paid attention, we've either not paid attention to the strategies they used to assert their belonging, as well as the ways in which the colonizers then denied them, or we analytically bifurcated this history from the modern European history of democratization and citizenship and rights formations. So I want to make the case that once we open our unit of analysis to allow for these struggles, we gain a different genealogy of modern citizenship and a much better understanding of racial politics today. Now, one more note on the prevalence of this nation-state assumption. This is not accidental, but rather, as Julian Go and Gurminder Bumrah have argued, it is an epistemic legacy of the European colonial project itself. European colonial projects have rested on a kind of spatial logic, separating the us from the over there, which has allowed Europeans to forget, in quotation marks, their own colonial involvement. I'm going to quote Stuart Hall here at length because I think it really drives the point home quite nicely. He says, the spatial organization of empire was an important factor in the process of forgetting. It was one thing to be deeply mired, as Britain was, in exchanging trinkets for captives in West Africa, shipping them across the Atlantic in a genocidal Middle Passage, selling their bodies into plantation slavery, exploiting their forced labor, consuming the commodities they produced, and repatriating the profits of an activity they could safely conduct hundreds of miles away without compromising the nation's self-image as a quote-unquote sceptered isle or quote green and pleasant land. It's quite another, in fact, an abrogation of the law of nature to have the natives' descendants next door, renting a room in your house, clipping your ticket on the bus, and touching your body in the hospital. So this spatial separation also marks the myth that we have inherited from the French Revolution, where the 1789 Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen states that, quote, men are born and remain free and equal in rights, assuming that political rights are universal, in theory attainable by all, without thinking very much about how these ideas came about in a colonial context. And then there's a temporal separation that is also quite widespread across particularly mainstream sociological approaches to racism in Europe. And it is again based on this methodological nationalism, but also on the temporal idea that racism began with the arrival of racialized people in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, with the onset of post-war immigration. So in effect, racism is due to the arrival of racist immigrants. And if this sounds tautological, that is because it is. And this has consistently framed our debate of racism as a question of integration. And we rarely think of different ways in which people have claimed belonging that goes back much further in history. And we rarely question belonging to what. And that is where my project tries to intervene. Okay, so the research question for this talk today is, how did revolutionary leaders in Saint-Domingue and then later Haiti articulate their belonging and assert their humanity? And the argument of my talk is this: taking a much longer historical view and one that tries to escape the methodologically nationalist lens, I think through France's the political formation that it was an empire. And specifically, I'll argue two things. First, that the question of citizenship and belonging for racialized people emerged during what are entangled histories of the French and the Haitian revolutions. And it's here where the enslaved and the colonized claimed their humanity, claimed their rights, and the colonizer denied them. And second, the revolutionary leadership in Saint-Domingue and Haiti employed different strategies to counter racist assumptions and to articulate their belonging to humanity. All right, a note on methodology. So my way of thinking about history is different to how historical sociologists usually think about the use of history. So I'm completely unhinged, going against everything. But I believe it's important to get a more accurate understanding of racial politics and their colonial legacies today. And the first thing I try to do in my reading of history is a kind of rethinking of theoretical concepts from the margins. And I take my inspiration from the Haitian anthropologist and historian Michel Trujillo, who noted that, quote, the silencing of the Haitian Revolution is only a chapter within a narrative of global domination. It is part of a history of the West, and it's likely to persist even in attenuated form, as long as the history of the West is not retold in ways that bring forward the perspective of the world. And then further, I see my project as a kind of history of the present because, this is a quote, one of the unavoidable strategies of liberation movements consists of bringing back to light the stories of the oppressed, the forgotten, and the marginalized, to question the dominant narratives and to break the linearity. It is from these revisions, these reinterpretations, that new theories can emerge. And this is from Françoise Vergès, who is a feminist anti-colonial thinker. Now, for the archival work underlying this chapter, which is still very much ongoing, I am relying on really the incredible work of Haitian historians and historians in Haitian studies, as well as my own reading of the primary documents of the Haitian Revolution, of which there are many, because the revolutionaries were very intentional about articulating their own narratives, as well as the intellectual and historical debates on and after the revolution and the legislation of the French colonial state and the National Assembly. And these documents are quite easily accessible from the Bibliothèque Nationale, the John Carter Brown Library, the Library of Congress, the British Library, the Digital Library of the Caribbean, and Haiti Trust. Okay. Now, in the year of 1790 alone, so just a few months after the Declaration of the Rights of Man, France captured 54,403 people to bring them across the Atlantic for work on French plantations in the Caribbean, 45,905 of whom would survive the journey. According to the Slave Voyages database, the French Empire brought over 1 million people across the Atlantic, the majority of whom to Saint-Domingue, which was the most important colony in France. Saint-Domingue was commonly referred to as the Pearl of the Antilles because it was also the heart of the world's economy. Now, it's really hard to overstate the economic significance of Saint-Domingue for France. And I like to go back to Sir Lloyd James's opening paragraph in The Black Jacobins, where he states, quote, "In 1789, the French West Indian colony of San Domingo supplied 2/3 of the overseas trade of France and was the greatest individual market for the European slave trade. It was an integral part of the economic life of the age, the greatest colony in the world, the pride of France, and the envy of every other imperialist nation. The whole structure rested on the labor of 500,000 slaves." So James connects the institution of racial slavery to the socioeconomic life of France at the time, the workings of capitalism. And then simultaneously, he also points out the fragility of the system, right? Resting on the labor of 500,000 slaves. And then, once in Saint-Domingue, the plantation world was governed by the Code Noir, so the slave codes, which reduced the enslaved to object status, so not human. Now, as a side note, I can offer you statistics about the enormity of the slave trade as well as the plantation world. But it bears mentioning that the archive and its technologies of dehumanization are incredibly violent. So this painting, for example, is a famous depiction of the ship called the Marie Seraphique, which did 4 voyages throughout the 1770s. And these voyages were organized from Nantes and then sailed from the Congo River to Saint-Domingue. And in this picture, we see the sort of practices of dehumanization, the packing of people alongside cargo, in shackles, of course. But we can also see the humanity and the cradling of children. So look, for example, here. So the archival work is always kind of this tension between the violence and trying to read it against the grain. Okay. So before we go into the historical case, I just want to make a note about the analytical framework that I use to analyze these historical materials. So first, I tend to look for cultural politics, right? So concepts are always embedded in meaning systems. For example, being a citizen meant to have reasoning faculties, which is modeled after the bourgeois man. What it means to be racialized is embedded in meaning systems. And my task is really to try and make these meanings explicit. Second, I said that my research question is about how the revolutionaries articulated belonging and assert their humanity. And I take this concept of articulation from Stuart Hall, by which he means a linking together of different cultural elements and political practices to produce new meanings. So, for example, to question taken for granted ideas of what it means to be Black, or to question the racialized exclusions of the category of the citizen. And then just a note on conditions of possibility. So because I'm interested in political subjectivities and how they get voiced through available narratives, I focus here on the political demands themselves and their limits. But this does not mean that the articulations are somehow divorced from material context. So for the Haitian revolutionaries to be able to articulate their own humanity, a set of conditions of possibility were essential for this. They had the strategic use of inter-imperial warfare, military warfare, the withholding of labor, the use of voodoo and African knowledge systems, and so on. So there's all this material context that is necessary for these articulation. But what interests me really is the interplay between French racial colonial politics and the revolutionaries' demands themselves. So that is why I focus on them in this chapter. Okay, now I'm going to tell this story in two parts. And the first is really to make a case for the entanglements of modern citizenship and racial slavery, to show how this question was present throughout these debates. And the history of these revolutions is incredibly complex. So this is going to be schematic. But I hope to bring across how questions of race and slavery were important at the birth of modern citizenship. All right, so one central question that arose during the early days of the French Revolution was whether these rights would apply to the populations of the colonies as well. And indeed, it was white delegates from Saint-Domingue who traveled to Paris to demand seats in the assembly, and the National Assembly granted 6 seats to these delegates from Saint-Domingue. So you see that immediately the nation-state assumption is inaccurate. Then arose a question of the rights for free people of color. And Saint-Domingue had a sizable population of free people of color, some of whom owned property, including enslaved people, and they paid taxes, which really raised the question as to why they were excluded from political representation in the assembly. And in 1789, 2 free men of color from Saint-Domingue made the case to the assembly that since they were property owners and paid taxes, they should be given political rights. They did not ask for the abolition of slavery, but asking for the abolition of discriminatory laws based on race raised alarm bells for the planters, who really saw their world of racial slavery unraveling. And ultimately, these 2 men were successful. But to understand the outcome of this debate, we really need to look at a third group commonly excluded from our stories of citizenship formation. The extension of citizenship to free men of color came in large part due to the onset of the revolution of the enslaved themselves. In 1791, the enslaved put their own freedom on the table by starting a rebellion in the northern part of Saint-Domingue that spread to almost 200 plantations. And reports of these revolts were read out loud in the National Assembly in Paris, which conjured up complete panic in the body of representatives. And after hearing these accounts, the National Assembly determined that granting rights to free men of color, would help to, quote, suppress the revolt and bring back order. So this decree is usually used to highlight the seeming universality of the French Revolution, of the French Republican citizenship conception, because it did not discriminate by race. It extended rights to free men of color. But the irony, of course, is that this decree was similarly intended to stop the revolts of the enslaved and to maintain the institution of slavery. Okay. Now, despite this, the passing of the citizenship decree for free men of color went against the will of the planters. And as a result, France sent 2 colonial commissioners, Sontenax and Polvarel, who will show up later. And they were tasked to enforce citizenship rights for free men of color in the colony. They tried to bring them into government and so on. And at the same time, reinstall social order, by which they meant to make sure to maintain the institution of racial slavery. And once the commissioners arrived, that's exactly what they tried to do. Okay, now in Paris, as we know, in January of 1793, the revolutionaries executed the king and the new French Republic is born. And this instantly produced a threat to other imperial monarchies in Europe, and England and Spain declared war on the new French Republic. And even though the enslaved were revolting in Saint-Domingue, it was still a very prosperous colony and of interest to England and Spain. So the war included the colonial empire and it spread to Saint-Domingue. So by 1793, three empires fought for control of Saint-Domingue. Okay. Now, we really can't think about the army of the enslaved and the military struggle of the enslaved without Toussaint Louverture, the extraordinary leader of the army, and I'll talk about Toussaint a little bit more in a second. But Toussaint very strategically exploited this situation of inter-imperial warfare through different alliances. And this produced a situation where the French commissioners, so Sonthonax and Poivarel, were faced with a situation where they had to try to entice the enslaved to enlist in the French army to fight for the French Republic. And for these reasons, the commissioners ended up breaking with their original mission of maintaining slavery, and they began to offer freedom and French citizenship in exchange for military service. So in 1793, Sonthonax declared freedom for the enslaved. And this news traveled from Saint-Domingue to Paris. In 1794, the National Assembly agreed with Sonthonax's political calculations. The Assembly ratified the act and they abolished slavery throughout the French Empire. So this meant that with this law, almost 1 million formerly enslaved people became French citizens. So what I hope I've shown so far is that the question of racial slavery was central to these debates around modern citizenship, because it was the enslaved that put it on the table. And I often get asked why one would try to read the history of modern rights and citizenship through this analysis of the colonial front lines, because there's an assumption that clearly there were none. Those questions don't apply. But as you can see, this is historically not true. This assumption that it's unthinkable and it's so hard for us to grasp is because we invest in a linear narrative of progress. And in so doing, we miss these moments, invoking Du Bois, where the slave stood a moment in the sun, moments that had potential and were then later suppressed. And here's how this happened. So here's a French commissioner, Sonthonax. So being conscripted into French citizenship meant something very specific for the newly freed. And these cultural meanings become clear through Sonthonax's proclamation, where he lists the conditions for citizenship. And these conditions rested on 3 pillars: the military logic of war, the need to work on the plantation, and the patriarchal idea of the family. So on the one hand, Sonthonax made very clear that it was the French Republic that had brought freedom for the enslaved. But then he also enforced a set of orders, including the need to stay on the plantation for the newly freed. And I think this is worth kind of reading at length to give you a sense of these documents. So Sonthonax addresses the newly freed French citizens. He says, nevertheless, don't think that the freedom you're going to enjoy is a state of laziness and leisure. In France, everyone is free and everyone works. In Saint-Domingue, subject to the same laws, you will follow the same example. Return to your workshops or to your former owners, and you will receive the wages of your suffering. You will no longer be subjected to the humiliating correction that was once inflicted on you. You will no longer be the property of another. You will remain masters of your own, and you will live happy. Having become citizens by the will of the French nation, you should also be zealous respecters of its decrees. You will doubtless defend the interests of the Republic against kings, less from a sentiment of your independence than from gratitude for the benefits it has bestowed on you. Freedom makes you pass from nothingness to existence. Show yourselves worthy of it. And then further, your slanderers and your tyrants maintain that having become free, the African will no longer work. Show that they're wrong. Redouble your emulation at the sight of the prize that awaits you. Prove to France through your activity that in joining yourself to the interest, it has truly increased its resources and its means. And then later, the commissioners go on to emphasize the spirit of the family, where the newly freed had to become dutiful husbands, fathers, and heads of households, and that this patriarchal position would make them into responsible citizens for the French Republic. So my point is that even in the moment when slavery was abolished and the formerly enslaved became French citizens, their humanity was not articulated just for what it was, but they got conscripted into being a particular kind of person to attain citizenship, right? And whether the formerly enslaved could be that person was very much in play. All right, and so with that, I'll shift to the second part of my analysis. So in what follows, I want to examine how the revolutionary leadership of the Haitians articulated their humanity, and specifically, I'm trying to identify the different strategies of claiming belonging to humanity and countering racialized ideals. So here's a preview. I think there are three broad strategies. The first strategy is a kind of engagement with French republicanism and the making concrete of a universal value. So specifically, to claim that the French Republican language of equality and freedom is to apply to enslaved people. Okay. The second strategy is some kind of refusal of Enlightenment categories, because from the perspective of the Haitians, they're tied to chattel slavery. And instead, freedom should be located in the anti-slavery struggle itself as the foundation for an assertion to humanity. And the historians Marlene Doubt and Chelsea Stieber have called this Black humanism. And the third strategy is some form of delinking from the Republican project and countering racialized conceptions of inferiority through a projection of strength. And the revolutionary leaders used these strategies subsequently in very, very different political contexts, learning from the experiences of the previous one. And I think that these strategies are instructive because they point us to ways of engaging with the French colonial project and republicanism. And we begin to see how the colonized and racialized assert humanity in the face of this denial. And then at the same time, as will become very clear in a second, these political arguments and imaginaries came hand in hand with the reproduction of oppressive state structures in Haiti. And for the newly freed peasants, so the masses, it became a very brutal way of life. And I would argue that this is partly the result, again, of colonial and neo-colonial pressures, and partly a result of the failure of elites. But in any case, I'm interested in the engagement with European racial and colonial projects, so I'm going to try and learn from these articulations. All right, the first strategy is what I'm calling engagement with republicanism and the making concrete, the extension of the universal value of equality to argue that it applies to the enslaved. And this strategy we can associate with Toussaint Louverture, the leader of the army of the enslaved. And this is how. So after the abolition of slavery in 1794, Toussaint forced the French commissioners of the island, and he instituted himself as the new governor of Saint-Domingue. And by the late 1790s in Paris, Napoleon rose to power, and Toussaint followed these events very closely and began to see that France was planning to re-invade Saint-Domingue and with the intention of reinstituting slavery. And so he counters with really a quite unusual move, because even though Saint-Domingue was still a colony of France, he ends up drafting his own constitution. And this constitution says something very interesting. He says there can be no slaves on this territory. Servitude has been forever abolished. And then he says all men are born, live and die there, free and French. All right, so Toussaint envisioned Saint-Domingue as some kind of an autonomous territory under Black self-rule, where slavery was forever abolished, but as part of France. And I think what he did is that he translated the freedom struggle of the enslaved into the language of rights. And he was convinced, or at least he projected that he was convinced, that he could persuade France that the mutually agreed upon values of freedom and equality applied to the formerly enslaved as well. So aligning the struggle of freedom from slavery with the revolutionary metropolitan project. He wanted freedom from slavery, equality, and Black self-rule, but as part of France. He never intended to pursue independence. But the mere insinuation of Black self-rule at a time where, you know, all kinds of racialized conceptions are prevalent was a major insult to France. So his strategy didn't work. And that year, Napoleon designated his brother-in-law, Charles Leclerc, to invade Saint-Domingue. And this war effort ended up bringing more than 80,000 troops throughout the duration of the invasion. And Toussaint ended up surrendering. Napoleon deported him to France, and Toussaint died in a prison cell in eastern France on the border to Switzerland in 1803. Now, from the ship, Toussaint wrote these famous lines, which are very beautiful. He says, "In overthrowing me, you've done no more than cut down the trunk of the tree of Black liberty in Saint-Domingue. It will spring back from the roots, for they are numerous and deep." Now, just as much as Toussaint adopted the egalitarian language of French republicanism to make a case for the freedom from slavery, he adopted precisely the language of the French ideologies around work and the responsibilities of the citizen that we saw earlier in Sonthonax's proclamation. So see, for example, this reflection. He writes, "I never believed freedom to be license, or that men who have become free should be able to give themselves over to disorder and idleness. My formal intention is that workers remain bound to their respective plantations, that they receive 1/4 of the revenues, that they not be mistreated with impunity. But at the same time, I want them to work harder yet than they've ever worked before, and that they be subordinate and fulfill their duties correctly, and resolve to punish severely he who strays." The articulation of freedom against the French racial regime came hand in hand with problems of state building. So Toussaint was determined to maintain the colony's economic output, hence having to force people back onto the plantations. He's faced with a war-torn country, which led to the militarization of the state, and so on and so forth. So this anti-slavery imaginary that he had came face to face with the oppressive nature of governing the colony. Right, second strategy. This is what I call refusal of Enlightenment categories, because they're experienced, these Enlightenment categories are experienced with so much hypocrisy, and rather they embrace the anti-slavery struggle as the foundation for freedom. So once it became clear that the French invasion sought to reinstitute slavery in Saint-Domingue, so the intention was to re-enslave French citizens, right? The army of the enslaved entered the battle, and Jean-Jacques Dessalines led them to victory a second time, beating France a second time. And after the withdrawal of French troops, Haiti instituted itself as the first Black independent state and home to free Black people in a colonial world that's still predicated on slavery. Now, of course, Dessalines had seen how Toussaint tried to argue his case through the use of Republican language, and he witnessed how Toussaint ended up being deported and died in a prison cell. So he took a very different route. And he tried to imagine a new conception of the people in a commitment, united in a commitment against colonization, where he says, let us swear to the whole universe, to posterity, to ourselves, to renounce France forever and to die rather than live under its domination, to fight until the last sigh for the independence of our country. He ended up rejecting the abstract principles of French republicanism because they were to him tinged with racial slavery and colonial rule. And he instituted freedom in the enslaved's own agency, suggesting that freedom cannot be given as a gift. It has to be taken. He says, the men who founded our independence to the prejudice of that consideration which powers never concede to people who, like us, are the authors of their own liberty, have no occasion to beg for foreign assistance to break the idol to which they were sacrificed. Okay. Now, Dessalines declared Haitian independence on January 1804, and he renamed Saint-Domingue Haiti, which is the name given to the territory by the indigenous Taino peoples. So he ends up recuperating this memory of indigenous peoples. And this constitution again declared slavery abolished. He declared that everybody was equal before the law, but I want to draw your attention to Article 14, which a lot of historians have written about. And this article states that all distinction of color among the children of one and the same family, of which the head of state is the father, necessarily ceasing, Haitians will henceforth be known by the generic denomination of Blacks. And for Dessalines, the category of Black was not a phenotypical category. It was a political category, because Blackness for him included all those that had historically risen against colonial oppression and racial slavery. So it didn't just apply to the formerly enslaved, but also to Germans and Poles who had helped in this fight, in this anti-colonial war. So now, even though it's European democratic struggles that have been universalized, the metropolitan debates never ask questions about the undoing of racial domination out of their own accord, even less so the upending of racial slavery. The question was forced on them. But from the perspective of the enslaved and the colonized, these are the kinds of questions that, of course, come up, and these are the questions through which French structures of oppression had to be overcome. Now, how does this end? Dessalines tries to gain recognition for Haitian independence, and he tries to find trading opportunities in the imperial world, of course, to no avail. In fact, the US did not recognize Haitian independence until 1862. So as a result, whenever he addresses the citizens of Haiti, he says there's a perpetual threat of war, which is true, again, resulting in the militarization of the state. And he again enforces a kind of obligatory labor regime to get people back onto the plantations. as the Haitian sociologist Jean Casimir notes, on the one hand, he's proclaiming a language of Black humanism, and on the other hand, he is reinforcing the exploitation on the masses. And now real quick, third strategy is what I call kind of delinking or countering of racialized conceptions of inferiority. After Dessalines dies, Henri Christophe, who was another military general, takes over leadership in the Haitian North, and he proclaims himself king. So in a global context where a Black self-ruling nation is a foundational threat to the entire world order, he aimed to gain international recognition through his power as a sovereign monarch with a strong military and all these grand infrastructure projects. And he declared that we will only treat with the French government as equals, power to power, sovereign to sovereign. He made sure to declare that Haiti would not export its revolution, which was important to the imperial anxieties of the time. And yet, in the metropole, planter interest groups and former slave owners launched a media campaign. So again, try to incite, try to reinstitute racial slavery in Saint-Domingue. So for 20 years, Haiti suffered under this continuous threat of further invasion. And in response, King Christophe reasserts that we will never become a party to any treaty, to any condition that may compromise the honor, the liberty, or the independence of the Haitian people. Okay, now to sum up, Christophe was this eloquent statesman, a kind of Negro king, as he became known. And while abolitionists used his case to make the case for an excellence of non-white people, he turned his attention inward, seeking to fortify the strength in northern Haiti. And he again ended up reimposing a militaristic regime and forcing labor regulations. Of course, I can't end this talk without noting that by 1825, a French naval fleet arrived in Saint-Domingue, laid anchor in front of Port-au-Prince, and the French king delivered notice that he would accept Haitian independence on the terms of transforming it into a commercial colony, direct quote, which meant that France ended up imposing a debt payment on Haiti, whereby Haiti had to pay for its own freedom, and it took them 122 years to pay off this debt that France was asking of them. Okay, I know this was a lot. Let me quickly wrap it up. So to conclude, I started this talk by pointing out that a spatial and a temporal assumption severely limits our analysis and theoretical tools. The spatial assumption of the nation state is misplaced because it limits our purview to see how the question of racial slavery was part of our history of modern citizenship. The temporal assumption, that is this idea that racism arrived with the racialized immigrant, is also misplaced because it blinds us to the long struggle of racialized peoples to belong and to assert their humanity. In the talk today, I've tried to suggest that examining questions of modern citizenship from the front lines of French governance of Saint-Domingue is instructive. It makes clear how the enslaved claimed their belonging to a modern community of citizens, how the colonizer denied it, and the various repercussions of this moment. It also points to different strategies of asserting one's humanity, from the use of egalitarian language towards the particular, the refusal of Enlightenment categories, and the attempt to counter racialized ideas. Now, what are the stakes of this? Well, the spatial nation state assumption and the temporal post-war immigration assumption have made us think about belonging of racialized people in France solely through the framework of integration. And this is problematic because we miss how conceptions of modern citizenship formed in the context of colonial rule. And what we miss how the colonized subjects have asserted their humanity and claimed their belonging in multiple ways, through calling for egalitarianism, refusal, and countering, which goes much beyond the very individualized process of integration into a seemingly race-neutral body politic. This case is the first chapter in my book, and I think it's a good beginning to force us to rethink our conceptualization genealogies of modern citizenship. Okay, so with that, thank you, and I look forward to our conversation.
Okay, marvelous. We've still got plenty of time. So Luciana, first.
Ricky, thank you so much for sharing your fabulous work. I've learned so much from you and from this talk. And I have, I guess I have two questions that I want to ask. One is about the framework or the posing of the initial problem as a problem of belonging, rather than, I don't know what other options there would be, but I mean, there's so many other concepts that are at play here: self-determination, sovereignty. And because to me it seemed like belonging already sort of presupposed a desire for a kind of inclusion that appears close to sort of the first of the three forms of articulation that you're describing, rather than opening really up a question that would include refusal as a mode of assertion. So I guess that's one question. It's like what is belonging doing for you analytically here? And the second is about, it seemed like there's also like a temporalization of these three forms of articulation. They sort of appear, it seems like they're appearing historically in a sequence. And I just wanted to ask you to talk more about that, whether that's the case or whether these debates were taking place simultaneously, and like whether they became options that were being debated simultaneously, and not because one failed and then therefore another one came about. I have more things to say, but I'll just keep it at that because I know other people will.
Okay. Yeah, you've sort of
Either you could respond or collect, whichever you prefer.
It was a lot. I would prefer to respond, otherwise I'll completely go bonkers. Yeah, thank you so much for these questions. And I think you've kind of put your finger on exactly the kind of tensions that I struggle with in trying to articulate the project. Particularly the first question is, I've gone through multiple ways of expressing, of like using different concepts and so on and so forth. But this is where I'm at now. This is why I've landed on this particular phrase. First, I want to use some kind of a language, in this case belonging, to get us out of thinking that the inevitable outcome of getting out of colonial rule is national independence, because it wasn't, right? We have this assumption that, of course, the colonial world ended up modeling the European nation state project, and that inevitably somehow we would have always ended up in independence. And that's not true, and that's really limiting as a framework. The second point is that I want to insist on making the connection between the struggles that are going on in the Caribbean, across the Caribbean, Haiti being one case, as being connected to larger questions of political modernity that we usually only think about in Europe. So I don't want to fall into this trap where we begin to see this as some kind of a particular anti-slavery, anti-colonial struggle, but really that this is something that is a central question in political modernity, right? Then the third part, and I completely agree with the problem that you've outlined, and I think the third part is that perhaps what I need to do throughout the book is, to just qualify this a little bit, to say that on the one hand, what people are doing is they're trying to belong to some kind of a community of humans, right? To get out of this racialized regime. But then on the other hand, that it's not about, being similar, being same, necessarily wanting to be integrated in something, because that's precisely what I'm trying to argue against. And I think it's always bad to answer a question by bringing in different materials, but because I'm thinking about the framing of the book, I'll just briefly say it. In a later chapter, I like to talk about the departmentalization of Martinique. Martinique is another island in the Caribbean that also has a history of racial slavery and French colonial rule. And Césaire, who is the kind of main architect of thinking about how to get out of colonial rule, makes a choice that he wants Martinicans to become French citizens. He goes against the sort of common political language of the time, which is about national independence. And he actually looks to Haiti and he says, see what happened in Haiti, staying part of France is the better option. And what ends up happening in Martinique is that there's a consistent problem of the self-articulation of identity. Martinique gets subsumed into France, which is exactly the kind of tension that you're talking about. So for Césaire, he in a sense achieves belonging to France, and Martinique becomes an equal department of France. To this day is lots of exceptions and so on and so forth. But the problem is deeper, where the sort of self-articulation, that the refusal that Dessalines is talking about, comes back to haunt Martinique, Guadeloupe, and Réunion by kind of insisting on belonging. Long answer. The answer to your second question about temporal sequence is a little bit easier. I think it is sequential, precisely because they're learning from each other to see, and the political context changes. Being faced with a French Republican project is different to being faced with Napoleon, and so on and so forth. So, yeah.
Hi, Ricky. I'm Luis. I'm a grad student in the sociology department. This is really brilliant and so generative, and I'm excited to continue talking about this. I guess one kind of tension I wanted to kind of follow up on this tension that I think, there seems to be a tension between like a citizenship project and a sovereignty kind of project. Mm-hmm. And it's both happening in the French and in the Haitian context, right? The French are sort of articulating rights as a gift is like, tied to, benevolent, universalist kind of, being perceived in a particular way. But anyway, I think I'm interested in like why the substance of the citizenship rights in the three phases sort of show this concern with kind of economic policy, right? And like a social order that sort of in emancipation, like still like we'll have family bonds, we'll have the institutions of work kind of somewhat set in place. And I'm curious, like how the sovereignty project is tied to like the very kind of limiting kind of articulation of rights that is sort of kind of seems to be conceived of like internally. And the other thing that this kind of made me think of, and these are kind of two kind of thoughts that I'm not quite sure how they, but I'm thinking of like Peggy Somers's work and in a Arabian kind of tradition of the right to have rights is somehow tied to statelessness. But here also the right to like give rights seems to be also tied to like sovereignty and statehood. And I'm curious how like maybe the project of like becoming a state that can give rights becomes tied to these kind of very delimited kinds of citizenship that are not free contract. They're not these kind, they're nothing, or like all key elements of the economic structure remain in place, even if we have freedom, right? So I don't know, I don't know if those are coherent thoughts.
No, this is excellent. My God. I mean, again, so Luis and I are going to be colleagues at Berkeley, so I'm going to just take this conversation over there for the next couple of years, because I'm not sure. A lot of these things are still like very much in process. So first, the economic logic of rights. That the maintaining the institution of racial slavery is of course central to the world economy at the time, and so particularly the French, but also the English begin to think about ways in which they could institute some kind of a labor regime, like give people rights that would lead to a continuation of exactly those same kinds of profits and the same kind of plantation economy. So really, it's never in any of these histories about rights in the actual truly universal sense, just because you are a person, but you need to be a particular person that is hardworking and that maintains that kind of capitalist logic, and with that you are allowed, so to speak, conscripted into the body politic. So that is there throughout. The other thing, though, that it's not just an economic logic, and I think this is important, particularly in the Haitian case. The citizen, generally the rights conception is also based on a particular cultural idea of, civilization, the reasoning faculties, and so on and so forth. So it's also racialized, and that is, that is the thing that the Haitian revolutionaries begin to push against, where they begin to say the inferiority that the colonizer has ascribed on us is unfounded, and we are, very much, I don't want to use the word deserving, but we are precisely able to employ these rights in the way, just in the way that you are. This is sort of just our strategy. So yes, there's an economic logic, but there's also a racial logic, and it's that I'm trying to think through. And then there's a question about rights being tied to statehood. Yeah, I mean, that's exactly, I think, what Dessalines ends up learning, right? Toussaint thinks that it is somehow conceivable to be free and French. And and the history shows that the French could not maintain this tension of having Black people be free, but also maintain a colonial relationship with them. And so as a result, they end up reinvading, trying to reestablish slavery. And as a result, Dessalines begins to, articulate that what you need in order to guarantee freedom for people is your own state, is independence, right? And so that's kind of, it's not a priori determined, but he ends up learning this in the process.
Okay. Hi, thank you. This was lovely. One thing I have to start by saying, at the very beginning, you use a map. In the map, Africa is shrunk. So if you want to do a true depiction of Africa, it has to be much bigger than the rest of the other continents, right? So by implication, you're using a map that the imperial sort of powers spatially redefine. So I would change the map.
Yeah, thank you.
Make sure it sort of goes with your narrative. What you are saying actually made me think a lot what happens to the idea of nation-state formation, especially when you take it out of the context of France, where it was, and it demonstrates, I think, for us, the significance of sort of normalizing and naturalizing European history and French history in this case. So it is very similar, the reactions you have to what happens in the Ottoman Empire in the aftermath of when there is the 1908 revolution, the Young Turk Revolution, and they have no idea what has happened. They say that there is this democracy that's going to come. Freedom looks like a woman who's like half naked. Some people are expecting like a woman to come, freedom, and deliver it to them. But one thing they do all say there is they say everybody stops going to work. And people say, no, you have to keep working. And that is the one thing they do. This freedom doesn't mean doing nothing. So it's very interesting that there is this conception of what does freedom mean, which also is very similar to what you do. I mean, what happens in your case. I would think about, I thought about the conception of Albert Hirschman's exit, voice, and loyalty, which may be a better, an interesting way of, because he says that's like 3 different kinds of market behavior you can do. Maybe that would be a way to approach it. One is, what do you think of that? The second is, what is important about citizenship, of course, it's a constructed identity, which has nothing to do technically with who you are, right? If it is a constructed identity, what other identities do we assume in society? Religion, of course, used to be the identity that comes before, which is similar to citizenship in the sense. So it would be interesting to see how religion or Catholicism or, how was that taken, or adopted or negotiated with the slaves? Do they have souls? Do they? There's a whole thing. I think that also may be relevant before citizenship. What do they do with Christianity? And because that's also another form of citizenship, so to speak. So you can maybe compare the two, which would be interesting before and, after kind of thing. There was a third thing, which now escapes me, but yes, I was thinking of mostly religion, and then yes, I'll stop there. I'm sure I'll think of the other one, and I'll tell you later what it is. But the whole, that was the third one has to do. Citizenship is predicated on laws, the legal system. For the first time, as you know, the legal system and the constitution becomes an alternate to before the religion and sort of its formulation. Because of that, what does it sort of also, I think, increases the significance of the state. So how much of the problems we have in this case in the colonization is because the state itself that dictates everything is in the metropole. So that brings the issue of what is the kind of colonial state that's built in Haiti and how is it different than the one in France in terms of authority and legitimacy that it has. Maybe that is the problem. It's sort of, you need to have a colonial state that sort of reproduces this system in a way in Haiti, but you don't have it, do you? I mean, or do you? I don't know. What is there? How does it mimic, as Homi Baba says, what goes on in France? And how is it similar to or different from that? So that was the third dimension, I thought.
This is recorded, right? So I can listen back. I mean, I feel I can just say thank you for all of this. One thing on the religion question is really interesting, and I haven't kind of thought through it very much, but I could because, citizenship from the French side, it is very much tied to questions of morality and questions of religion, whereas another strategy of combating this kind of the racialized idea that the French bring is the Haitian bringing into their own political subjectivities African religions, voodoo and so on and so forth. So religion actually is a very nice axis to begin to think about these questions of engagement and refusal as well, which I haven't done, but could do, and I like it very much. So thank you for that. On the legal question, yeah. So I mean, first of all, they take a lot of, unfortunately, the Haitians, particularly and Toussaint, but then also later throughout independence, take a lot of the colonial laws around labor regulation and reimpose those, so that that stays. I mean, I suppose I would just again assert the context in which we have to think about the Haitian state project, say as compared to the French state project, just because the Haitian state project, ends up being under this like massive assault from multiple different imperial forces over decades, including, this is not meant to romanticize elites, it's just meant to give us a better understanding of the predicaments of the post-colonial conditions, where you start out with these strategies of asserting a humanity, but then you have to confront a whole set of governance questions, state questions, labor questions, and so on and so forth, under the pressure of a naval fleet that is waiting outside your ports, and so on and so forth, the pressure of dealing with a world economy that doesn't want to trade with you. And so, there, I think beginning to understand the Haitian case really requires us to just go back and forth between the local and the global to begin to understand the legal instruments they end up using.
Yeah, thank you so much for the talk. I have a question about the latter two strategies that you mentioned. And this is sort of a clarifying question for me, I guess, maybe, but in thinking about the periodization between them, and also assuming that the concept of delinking comes from Walter Mignolo, if that's who you need to invoke there. Is the claim that in the second one, it doesn't constitute a delinking because there's an investment in that Black humanism that you mentioned? And then, in other words, you could have more radical, like Afro-pessimist analysis that the human itself is not a useful category, but that's not what they did at Haiti. And if so, in the third one, I think I just missed it, but if you could clarify again that what exactly the delinking strategy is, because monarchy is a political form, is probably not an example of delinking, but I think you mentioned something about contesting the racialized logic and these hierarchies of, we have Black Haitians acting a certain way, which is associated with whiteness and valued in a particular way that they're contesting. So I think I missed you when you said.
Yeah, it's because A, I went really fast, and B, I'm still trying to think through that distinction. So again, thank you so much for the question. So it's precisely what you said. So in Dessalines, there's very much an investment in building a basis for Black humanism, but also in practice become a safe haven for enslaved people elsewhere. So he's really thinking, be ahistorical in a Pan-African way, right? Which comes later, but it's that kind of idea. And then, with regards to Christophe, so I showed this painting about the court of Christophe because he ends up, the strategy is quite striking. The strategy that he ends up using is to basically institute a French royal court. And Christophe is the one who is in consistent negotiations with the French around the debt payment. I didn't talk about this, but Haiti ends up splitting into two, and the southern part of Haiti is governed by somebody who's much closer aligned with French republicanism, and his name is Pétion, and he ends up agreeing to a negotiation with France around the debt, whereas Christophe just rejects any kind of insinuation that it would be in any way reasonable to pay debt to France. So there is this kind of assertion of sovereign to sovereign, monarch to monarch. He ends up dying and the debt comes. So
thank you, Ricky. This was fascinating. I learned a lot. I have also 3 points, questions to ask that I want to learn more from you. One, with following what Miguel said about religion, I also thought immediately about the question of religion, but not in the sense that she proposed, how do Haitians self-conceptualize themselves before French arrived, but in a manner of did the church or the religion had any influence, you think, in the way these leaders think about independence, like the Black church had role here in the US, or liberation ideology in Latin American countries? Does the idea of being equal men, under the eyes of God, have any influence, you think, in this moment of struggle? And because as I listen to you, I got a little bit confused and thought for, is this a struggle for nationhood, like a nation recognition as a nation state, or rather as your bigger question takes belonging to the center, or recognized as human? Because even the leaders still use French names. They even when refusing the racial hierarchy, they claim that free and French. So I wonder, where does the question of Haitian nationhood come into place, or when, after what event, or what process? And my third question was networks of the leaders. I am very curious, are these official members of the Central French Army who were sent to mission, or are they also formerly enslaved people coming from the plantations? Because their insistence of continuing the work in plantations was very interesting. Do they also have properties? That's one.
I should have, let me take the last question first. I should have said that. But they're all formerly enslaved. That's really incredible work by sort of Atlantic historians and Haitian historians about how African practices of warfare ended up shaping the Haitian Revolution. It's precise. So Haiti was, Saint-Domingue, I should say, Saint-Domingue was a very, very violent plantation society, which meant that there was a lot of, people who had experienced the slave trade, people who had, so it wasn't a plantation society that kind of reproduced itself, but it had to be consistently replenished, so to speak, and in the colonial mind. And so people had very near memory of Africa, of African warfare, of African military practices. And that is how people like Toussaint and Dessalines ended up having this kind of military knowledge. Then what else? The second question is this a struggle? Is this a struggle for the nation state? So I suppose what I'm trying to do is to, rather than assume the category of the nation as kind of an a priori category within which political struggle happens, I try to turn it around and see, how did we end up in this world of nation states? And I think that beginning this the other way around, that means we, first of all, open ourselves up to all kinds of other historical possibilities that were possible. And as I said, the other former French colonies did not become nation states. They became part of France. So Haiti really went on its own journey, and 200 years earlier than really the post-colonial moment. So I try to, oftentimes really there is this assumption that, independence is the logical outcome, and it does end up being the outcome in the Haitian case, but not for trying other options. And people really, I think, at least in the story that I'm trying to tell, are concerned about getting out of this kind of racialized order. And for Toussaint, for example, if that had ended up being part of France, but being French and equal, as he says, so free and French, then that would have been, his preferred option. It's just that when Napoleon comes to reinvade and try to re-enslave people that had already gotten citizenship, that's when, that's when Dessalines learns that this kind of autonomy within an imperial federation is not meaningful, is not sustainable, rather.
Did you get the last question?
Oh, sure.
Yes, please. Go right ahead.
Okay, thanks. So I really like this way of putting your contribution at the end of the first paragraph. Racial slavery was part of our history of modern citizenship, or resistance by racial slaves was part of it. Because at the beginning, it almost sounded like you were making a much stronger claim, and maybe this was just my confusion, and if so, then in subsequent presentations you can clarify for people like me.
Yeah.
But it almost sounded like you were making the claim that this resistance by racial slaves, that was like the origins of modern citizenship, or that because the French Revolution was the origins of modern citizenship, and this resistance by racial slaves, this happened at the same time. These things were both the origins. And I think that the quote by Brubaker kind of made this more confusing for me, because he has this spatial assumption, but also a temporal assumption, not this like a second temporal assumption, not this one right there, but that origins of modern citizenship tied up with the nation state and with this kind of time period. But it obscures this really big literature about nations are really old. They're much older than France and the French Revolution. They date maybe as far back as the 1400s, or even like there's work arguing that like the ancient Hebrews were a nation, or the ancient Greeks or something. So
Anthony Smith, yeah.
right. So I really like this kind of moderate way of putting it, because if you were in fact making the other claim, it sounds like a worrisome overclaim. And that was my thought.
Got it. Yeah, thank you for pointing that out. I mean, I kind of run with this assumption that I do think is quite prevalent in the literature that it's the French Revolution that brought together this universal idea of political rights with the nation state. I think that's, at least in sociology, that's become sort of a venerable myth that we all kind of reproduce. And I do try to trouble that origin story of the French Revolution. Not so much to say that, oh, the Haitians had it earlier, but rather that the Haitians pose a different set of questions that are related to this modern conception of citizenship, but that never come up for the metropolitans, because to them, they operate in a racialized understanding of a racialized world order of who is a human. And that the Haitians live in this world of modern citizenship, right? They get the news from the French Revolution, but they also have a lived experience of racial slavery. And they begin to see that really the question of freedom is a question of asserting humanity, quite literally. And so, I'm trying to say that if we want to get a better understanding of modern citizenship, what it is, what it does in the world, we need to think about it in terms of race, in terms of racism, in terms of the particular projections that it has brought to this world and the ways in which people contested it.
Fantastic way to conclude. Wonderful talk, and thanks so much for everything. And please join me in congratulating her camera.
Thank you very much.